Today we're back with the 1.9 Wraith, and we're going to replace the links and add twin turbos. What's going on, guys? Today we're back with the Axial Wraith 1.9, and today we're going to replace the plastic links that come on this vehicle with a brand new set of Incision Stainless Links. This is a new link set that will fit the Axial Wraith 1.9, the Axial Deadbolt, and the Axial 69 Blazer. These all come in a 12-inch wheelbase as compared to the 12.3-inch wheelbase that we've seen on some of the other Axial SCX-10 style vehicles. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the installation of this 10-piece link set and show you exactly how everything goes on. After we do that, I'm going to do a couple of other upgrades. First, I'm going to also take the opportunity to replace the servo. I'm going to take that Tactic servo out from up front and I'm going to replace it with a Protek 370 TVL. Now, this is a little too much servo for the internal BEC on the stock ESC. If you're not familiar with what that is or what that means, there is a circuit inside of your ESC, or electronic speed control, and that is what sends power to your servo. And what happens when you install a very powerful servo into a vehicle like this is that you require more power than it can give. And what will happen is when you give it steering input and it tries to draw all of that power that it requires to turn those wheels like you're telling it to, is that the ESC will basically just shut down. The easy fix for that is to buy an external BEC, like a Castle 10 amp BEC. Those are about 20 bucks. You have to add that to the cost of what you're upgrading, or you can change the ESC to something with a very powerful internal BEC. Today, I'm not going to install an external BEC because I do plan to change out the motor and ESC in this in the future. So for now, I'm gonna hold off on this. But basically what that means is that after this video, I still have more work to do before this truck is completely ready to go. But we'll get to that in later videos. Now, after I replace that servo, I have to plug it into the receiver. And since I'm in there anyway, I'm going to take the opportunity to replace that receiver with one of my Futaba. This is a 2106 GF. Now, the 2106 GF is actually an air receiver, but it's a less expensive receiver and it will still work with many of the Futaba land systems. So you can save yourself some money, get this nice compact laydown style receiver, which also is a 6-channel receiver. Granted, my radio is a 4-channel radio, so I'll only have 4 available channels, but I've got extra spots to plug in all kinds of accessories if I wanted to go that route. And lastly, we're gonna add twin turbos. Now, the twin turbo part is not the main point of what the upgrade is actually going to be. In the front of the Axial Wraith, the bumper mount comes straight out from the front of the shock tower area, but it's a single unsupported tube out there. And it seems like it can be a weak point. I've seen a couple of people who have had actual issues with it up to this point. So what I did is I came up with a 3D printed brace option that sleeves over that tube and then goes up and captures another point to give it more rigidity. So we're gonna beef up the front of this chassis before we have any issues. And then I figured, since I'm up there and I'm already making something, why don't I just integrate in mounts for the included turbos that come in the parts bags? So this little 3D printed bracket that I made up has a flanged area where you can either bolt or double-sided tape the servo to. This puts the turbos up in front of the engine in a logical location. So we can have it up there and then later on we can add some intake tubing or things like that to try and really finish it off. But for today, we're gonna just brace the chassis, mount the turbos, and we'll get to any details that we may or may not add in the future at a later date. So let's get to wrenching. To start this process off, we're gonna go ahead and just remove all 4 wheels and tires. And before the video, I actually pre-installed all of the rod ends and pivot balls onto the links, except for one. And I left one incomplete because I wanted to show you my process of how I do this. If you've been around RC kits for any length of time, you've most likely threaded on a rod end onto a link of some sort. There's nothing real secretive about this, but I'm constantly building so many links that trying to find a faster way was definitely something that I was interested in. So I've got one of these Zerba tools that I've got from RC Scaleworks, and what this is a 3D printed tool that holds your rod end in place. But this is only part of the solution. Next, I take the entire link and I chuck it into my drill. And then I just power thread this thing into the rod end. So I can do one side of basically all of these links in maybe 2 or 3 minutes. The other side can be a little bit more tricky because you can't chuck it into the drill with a rod end pre-installed. So my solution for that was to take an Axial dog bone cup, grind it larger in the center area so that it easily holds a rod end. And then I added an O-ring and a groove around the outside just to make sure that it couldn't slide out. With this tool, I take and I chuck this piece into my drill. I take my other rod end and I still put it into the 3D printed Servo tool. I hold the link roughly into position in the rod end, and then I use that modified dog bone to drive the link. And now I've got my completed threaded rod ends. To do all 10 links and put the pivot balls in place takes about 10 minutes or less then. We're gonna start this installation by removing the 4 screws that hold the skid plate in place. From here, I'm going to remove the 4 screws that hold the rear links to the skid plate. Then I'm gonna remove the 3 screws that hold the links to the axle. I'm gonna start by replacing the rear upper links first. With the rear upper links in place, I'm going to make sure that the drive shaft is back engaged. Then I'm going to replace the lower links. With the rear links completed, we're going to move to the front, and I'm going to remove the 3 screws that hold the front links on. And again, we're going to remove the 3 screws that hold the front links to the axle. I'm going to replace the front upper, then the front lowers. With the upper and lower links installed, we can now replace the bolts that hold the skid plate in place. Now we need to replace the drag link, panhard, and tie rod. And for convenience of our lighter modifications as well, at this point I'm going to go ahead and just remove the body. There's 1 screw on each side of the A-pillar, 4 screws in the grill, and 4 smaller screws around the bottom side of the body. We can pull the body up, and then we can feed the grill back through the hole in the body. This just helps us with a little bit of access, and now I'm going to remove the drag link, panhard, and tie rod from the front axle. I'm going to start by replacing the panhard link. Then we're going to put the driver's side of the tie rod in place. When replacing the passenger side, we need to line up both the drag link and tie rod. Now at this point we would normally connect the drag link to the servo horn, but I'm going to replace the servo as well. So I should have actually pulled the servo out before I put the panhard link back on. But we're going to pull that out and remove this electronics box so that we can get inside of the receiver, replace it while we're at it. To remove the receiver box lid, there's actually 4 screws on the bottom of the receiver box here that you can access. So loosen all 4 of those so that you can remove that lid. So we pulled out that Spectrum SRX 200 and we're going to put in our Futaba 2106 GF. This is a nice compact receiver. It's quite a bit more slender than the Spectrum version, and it's got a lay-down style pin setup rather than the stand-up version that you may be used to. With that Tactic servo removed and still in good working order, we're going to keep this for a later use. As I mentioned before, we're going to be installing this Protek 370 TBL servo. This is an all aluminum case, super high torque servo. This is a 25 tooth servo horn, so I'm going to be using the Vanquish 25 tooth 20 millimeter long servo horn. Before installing the servo horn onto the servo, we want to make sure that we get it centered. Now you can kind of rotate it both ways to the maximum extent and then just kind of guess at the center. Usually I can get pretty close, but you can also use a little servo tester. Now this unit will send whatever signal you want to the servo horn, or you can put it in the neutral setting so the servo will center itself so that you can put the servo horn on exactly where you want it. We have to remember that the servo output goes towards the front of the vehicle, and then the servo horn needs to point directly forward. So we're going to tighten down that servo horn to make sure that it's fully seated on the splines. And with that done, we're then going to tighten the 2 clamping screws. Now we're going to install the 370 into the chassis. We can then plug it into our receiver. Remember, servo goes in 1, ESC goes in 2, 1 to steer, 2 to clear, 1 to throw, 1 to go. I don't know, people have all kinds of rhymes for it. Anytime you have to remove or replace wires that go through that gasket in the Axial waterproof receiver box, make sure that you note that there's a little plug that goes in the open slot in there. So to keep it really waterproof, you need to make sure that you put that back in place. And now for our last step, our drag link onto our servo horn. For this step, I am going to use a small amount of Loctite on that screw. So now we've got all new links, new servo, new receiver. All that's left now is a couple of turbos. Now, again, the point of this mod is not specifically for adding turbos. It's more for chassis strength. Up in the very front of the Wraith chassis, there's only 1 tube that comes up to support this front bumper. And it's just a long piece of air. And it's just a long area that kind of hangs out there, and then where the screw mounts to this shock tower is going to be an obvious stress point, and just it needs some reinforcement. This is going to break at some point if you don't do something. So this is the part that I came up with. It's a piece that slides over this lower tube section here, and then it goes up and mounts in front of the servo. There's these two bosses in front of the servo there that are just unused. Don't know what they had planned for it, or if there's a future modification or upgrade part, who knows what it is. But I came up with this little piece that slides over the tube and then bolts into that location. Should just give you some extra strength to help hold that chassis nice and solid. In my first test prints, it definitely made a difference. I think over the long run, it'll probably work out pretty well. But since I was making an area that went up there nice and simple, I figured I'd add this flanged area to mount those included turbos that come in the Axial parts tree. Now, these are a two-piece turbo that you need to bolt together. It does not come with the hardware. You will need to find a piece of hardware to bolt the two halves together. But this is what we're going to mount. I'm going to put them up in the front area here, just behind the grill. It's a logical place that a twin turbo setup could be with an LS engine like this. Made sense, so figured that would be the place to mount it. Now, this large rectangular flange area is where the inlet side of the exhaust would be, and that's where we're going to mount. You could simply take and add some double-sided tape and attach it to this 3D printed part if you would like. Or, like I've done, I drilled a very small hole, and then I've actually 3D printed a hole in the flange so that you can screw it together with something like an M2.5 screw. I just drilled it fairly close to the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw the turbo to this mount first, and then we're going to install it into the chassis. So this is how our turbos will be oriented. One with the compressor wheel going from the bottom side and one from the top side. Just like in a real turbo system, you'll need to orient the compressor outlet side to point towards where the intake portion of the engine is going to be. Now, to install the chassis braces, we need to first remove the front bumper. Remove the two set pins holding the front bumper in place. And then remove these two screws holding this front bumper bracket onto the chassis. Now we need to slide these over the chassis through this large hole on the bottom of the chassis brace. With those slid in place, we can replace that front bumper support. And then you need to find two 18mm screws that go through the chassis braces and into that chassis boss. So now they're comfortably in place. My turbos touch this front radiator support, but not by much. It's still plenty of freedom there, so I'm not too worried about anything. So at the end of the day, with those few upgrades, pretty big difference to the vehicle. The lowdown weight of the stainless Incision Link set is going to be a nice little change. It's going to keep this thing nice and planted. I had a blast driving this thing before, but that little bit of weight down low is going to be a noticeable difference, I think. The difference between the stock Tactic servo and this 370 is going to be extremely noticeable, of course. However, there is one thing about this 370, and that it's a little bit tall from the mounting surface to the very top of the servo horn, or the top of the case even. So it pushes it a little bit closer to the panhard link than I would really like to see. Servos vary greatly, even when they're a 1/10 scale style servo, and this one a little bit taller than I was really looking for, so maybe that's not as ideal for this vehicle as I was hoping it would have been. If I have too many clearance issues, I may end up swapping that out to a Futaba. The issue is that when you articulate up the passenger side, that link will actually contact the servo horn. Now, I'm using a Vanquish servo horn, which is one of the most low profile servo horns you can get, and it still hits it. So we're gonna see how this works. We're gonna play it by ear. I'll run it a couple of times, see if I think it should stay in here or if maybe we do another swap. But our chassis brace definitely made a big difference. That front bumper now is super rigid. You can tell that when you really force on this thing now, that force is transmitted further back. You can see the rest of the chassis reacting rather than just the front side of that tube. I'm very happy that I got that accomplished before I had any issues. I'll put a link in the description below where you can pick up those chassis braces, the link set, and everything else that I used in today's video. I'm also holding on to some of those plastic links that we took off because we're going to use them in the next video when we do our fastback modification. So stay tuned for that one. If you guys have other modifications you'd like to see beyond what we've already started to tackle, absolutely throw them in the comments below. Thanks for all the comments on the last one. Having a lot of fun with the 1.9 Wraith. So with that, guys, thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see them as soon as they get uploaded. And thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.